Books of magic, called grimoires, are a common trope in pop culture. There's the Darkhold in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In the Disney version of the classic fairy tale Snow White, the evil queen turns to a shelf of scary-looking books for just the right spell to enchant Snow White. And H.P. Lovecraft's fictional grimoire, the Necronomicon, has been terrifying readers both in his stories and in real life since its first appearance in 1924. Though of course, grimoires are not merely the products of pop culture, and in fact, these examples from the fantasy genre can actually give us a distorted picture of magical practice. Today, grimoires are most visible among contemporary witches, many of whom use a book of shadows to record their workings and preserve their traditions for posterity. But living in an era of mass literacy and mass media, this is a fairly recent development in the history of grimoires. Practitioners of magic have been writing, copying, and using literary magic practically since the invention of writing itself, and we can find grimoires in many cultures all over the world. So today we'll be discussing what are grimoires, but also why are grimoires? What is the motivation to create compendia of literary magic? And what do grimoires reveal about the changing nature of magical knowledge and practice? First, the basics. A grimoire is a book that contains magical rituals, especially instructions for conjuring spirits or making magical objects like amulets. Some use the analogy of a textbook of magic. We don't exactly know where the word comes from. It may derive from the French word grammaire, which technically originally referred to books published in Latin, but by the 1700s referred to books of magic specifically, possibly because these were the sorts of books that were more likely to be circulating in Latin instead of French. And by the 1800s, the word grimoire had entered the English lexicon, broadly to describe many kinds of magical books. Some of the most popular and influential grimoires have included the Key of Solomon, the Black Pullet, the Book of St. Cyprian, and the Long Lost Friend, all of which you can still find and use today. Now, for most of history, most people couldn't read or write. No matter the culture, writing and reading complex literature like these books was only possible for a small group of literate elite specialists. So the first aspect we'll explore here is that grimoires emerged as a specialized intellectual pursuit among elite practitioners, serving as a means to preserve, systematize, and regulate esoteric knowledge within educated circles. A great example of this is a collection called the Greco-Egyptian Magical Papyri, a vast collection of magical texts preserved in the dry climate of Egypt. You're looking at a few examples I filmed at the Coptic Museum in Cairo. They date roughly from the 1st century BCE to the 6th century CE, and they're composed mostly in Greek and the Egyptian languages of Coptic and Demotic Egyptian. Now, we're looking at just a few fragments here, but these texts did originally circulate in larger scrolls and codices that we could properly call grimoires. These papyri contain a range of small-scale personal rituals, calling upon various spirits, gods, or the dead to help with a range of problems. Sickness, bad luck, conflict, romance, you name the issue, you can probably find a spell addressing it. They include curses, protective spells, and formulas for divination and visions. As an example, here's a formula for a migraine headache. Take oil in your hands and utter the spell, Zeus sowed a grape seed. It parts the soil, he does not sow it, it does not sprout. Here's another one for a fever. On the shiny side of an olive leaf, write this symbol, and on the dark side, write this symbol, and wear it as an amulet. Many of these formulas are practical spells like these, though other examples are lengthy, poetic hymns and incantations, like the so-called Mithras liturgy. This is a text from the Great Magical Papyrus of Paris, a 36-page papyrus grimoire with over 3,000 lines of text. The text is basically an elaborate purification rite to gain immortality and meet the god Helios Mithras face to face. Which brings us back to grimoires being all about the elite preservation of knowledge, at least in the pre-modern period. Tell me, who in late Roman Egypt was capable of composing and copying something like the Mithras liturgy? Egyptian priestly scribes. Specialized expertise was required to produce these texts. These spells are often multilingual, weaving together Greek or Coptic, intermingling the cursive writing system known as hieratic. Only a scribe trained in an Egyptian temple scriptorium could have produced these texts. Moreover, these spells reflect the concerns of scribes, like what kind of writing surface or ink should you use for a spell. Really not the sort of thing your average illiterate farmer cared about in late Roman Egypt, but definitely something that preoccupied your mind if you were a literate priest. Also, like I mentioned, a lot of these texts contain hymns or prayers that look a lot like what was performed in official cultic contexts, like during a procession or a sacrifice. For example, in the Mithras liturgy, we see possible parallels with rites of purification in Egyptian temples, when priests purified themselves before entering the divine presence in the sanctuary. So in a sense, a lot of these magical formulae may have been privatized practices borrowed from public temple institutions. Also, grimoires throughout history often emphasize the importance of being passed down through a recognized chain of authenticity and authority. The Key of Solomon is attributed to King Solomon. Another ancient text is called the 8th Book of Moses, dating to the 4th century CE, and it mentions other books of magic attributed to Moses, like the Key of Moses and the Secret Moon Book of Moses. Linking grimoires to revered figures like Solomon or Moses highlights the importance of legitimacy when it comes to magical texts, where authority is derived not just from the rituals themselves, but also from the legendary lineage of these texts. We see this in the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri as well. The scribes apparently were self-aware that they were part of a rarefied lineage of copyists, and they mention that, sometimes claiming divine or mythical origins. For example, one spell says, "There is nothing greater than the procedure. It was tested by Manetho, who received it as a gift from Osiris, the greatest god. Perform it successfully and silently." This is a claim of divine authority and authenticity. The copyist claims that this spell came from Osiris himself, who passed it on to the famous Egyptian priest Manetho. So the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri are a striking example of how grimoires emerged as a way to safeguard and transmit specialized knowledge. For most of human history, before widespread literacy, grimoires were primarily the domain of elite specialists, educated scribes like Egyptian priests who positioned themselves as custodians of esoteric knowledge. It's a pattern that we see in many different cultures across history, a consistent link between literary magic and elite specialization. Now, as we'll see later, this is completely upended in contemporary witchcraft with the advent of widespread literacy. But first, let's turn to another reason for the development of grimoires: the ritual power of writing and books. Grimoires contain magic, sure, but they also function in and of themselves as magical objects. For example, consider the curious apocryphal story of Jesus in King Abgar of Edessa, now the city of Şanlıurfa in Turkey. According to a very early Christian tradition, King Abgar got sick, and so he sent a letter to Jesus to come and heal him. Jesus wrote back saying, "Sorry, can't make it, I'm busy in Jerusalem, but I'll later send one of my apostles to heal you." Now, the story is not historical, but notice something. This is one of the very few examples in Christian literature of Jesus writing something. Early Christians noticed this, and so they copied the letter as a magical object, often as a protective amulet. The historian Procopius mentions the people of Edessa inscribing the words of the letter of Jesus on the city gates for protection. An archaeologist even discovered a door lintel from the city of Ephesus inscribed with the entire letter. Someone wanted to protect the entrance of their house, and so they decided inscribing the letter of Jesus was the best way to do that. Now, we're a little far from the topic of grimoires with this example, but my point is that writing itself has been viewed as magical by countless cultures throughout history. An object like a book or a piece of paper or a door lintel inscribed with the very symbols of writing on them are magical. The scholar of ancient Mediterranean magic, David Frankfurter, puts it this way: in pre-modern semi-literate cultures, writing was not primarily viewed as a tool for communication. Instead, writing was first and foremost material and iconic symbols, things and pictures. Think of it this way. Global literacy for us today is somewhere between 80 and 90%. So for most of us today, when we look at words on a page, we immediately, almost subconsciously recognize them as sounds and sentences. But if you didn't know how to read, like most people back then, you'd encounter a book first and foremost as a physical object with iconic symbols, rather than something that conveyed ideas or sounds. This is a huge part of the magic of writing. To quote Dr. Frankfurter again, the cultural, historical, and magical significance of writing comes down to their material and iconic power. The authority the words bear, what beings lie behind them, how one shows, manipulates, or contains their power. So to return to the letter of Jesus to Abgar, it didn't matter what the letter said. What mattered is that Christians believed that these words came from the pen of Jesus himself. The words themselves convey the miraculous healing powers of Jesus, from his hand to the pen to the paper, almost contagiously. The words access and manipulate ritual power when inscribed. We see this even with the Bible. Ancient Christians used Bible verses as magical amulets, writing a verse on a fragment of papyrus or inscribing one on their door lintels. Other Christians apparently viewed a Bible codex itself as a magical object. St. Augustine himself seems to allude to the practice. When your head aches, we praise you if you place the gospel at your head, rather than running to an amulet. Not because it was done for this reason, but because the gospel is preferable to amulets. Now, Augustine doesn't seem to endorse the practice, but apparently some Christians were known to put a copy of the gospel by their head to cure a headache. We see the ritual power of writing in Islamic cultures as well. In his article Drinking the Quran, the anthropologist Abdullahi Osman Al-Tam studied a practice among the Muslim communities of the Darfur region in western Sudan. Local scribes would write Quranic verses on a wooden slate. They would then wash off the words into water, which was then drunk by the scribe's clients for healing and protection. For these Christians or Muslims, the words of the Bible or the Quran are believed to have inherent power, even when dissolved in water. It doesn't matter what the words mean or what they communicate. What matters is the ritual power they can convey. That's not to say that the Bible or the Quran are grimoires in the technical sense. I wouldn't say that. But they are examples that the written word throughout history has been viewed as magical, simultaneously a vehicle of communication and a vehicle impregnated with power, to quote Dr. Frankfurter again. A lintel inscribed with a biblical passage now radiates the protective potency of that passage. A prayer or invocation inscribed on some substance maintains its utterance, its performative efficacy, long after the moment of vocalization. So returning to grimoires, they emerged not only out of the elite preoccupation with preserving and transmitting magical knowledge, but also out of this concept of the magic of the written word. The concept of the magic of writing emerged in a predominantly oral culture, in which the fixing of words, names, commands, and invocations on substances using graphic symbols involves a fundamental mystique. And throughout history, we see grimoires possessing a fundamental mystique, with them functioning not just as books of magic, but also as magical books, believed to be objects imbued with ritual power. Now, both of these aspects of grimoires have evolved over the centuries. Today, a grimoire is more likely to look like a 3-ring binder of spells as it does a papyrus scroll in the hieratic script. With the rise of mass literacy and mass media, literary magic has been effectively democratized. So, how did we get here? The shift from handwritten manuscripts to the printed word marks a turning point in the accessibility of magical knowledge. With the invention of the printing press, you could print a bunch of occult books, allowing an expanding literate public in early modern Europe to access what was once the domain of an elite few. By the 1600s, printed copies of medieval grimoires were finding their way into the personal libraries of educated artisans and tradesmen. For example, a London-based astrologer and physician, Simon Forman, kept his own library of medieval grimoires, like the Ars Notoria, Picatrix, and Liber Raziel. He even wrote his own book of necromancy. So sure, literary magic was still the domain of a relatively small slice of the population, but nowhere near as exclusive as the ancient Egyptian priesthood. And along with the democratization of literary magic came a backlash from religious authorities. In the late 1500s, the Pope published the Indexes of Prohibited Books, which included all manner of magical texts, including major grimoires like the Key of Solomon. Though some historians actually think this backfired, making these books even more popular. For example, the Key of Solomon was super popular in early modern Italy, which may have been sparked by being mentioned in the Index of Prohibited Books. Moving into the 1900s, one of the most influential developments in the history of grimoires was the emergence of the religion Wicca. In the 1950s, the British civil servant Gerald Gardner began writing publicly about his involvement in modern witchcraft, claiming membership in a surviving witch cult driven underground during periods of Christian persecution in Europe. According to him, witches operated in secretive initiatory groups called covens, performing rituals out of the Book of Shadows, a kind of cookbook that preserved both ancient occult secrets and a coven's practical magical techniques. The phrase Book of Shadows is speculated to have originated with a Sanskrit divination manual. The term appeared in a 1949 issue of the London-based newsletter The Occult Observer, in an article by the palm reading specialist Mir Bashir. Bashir tells of an encounter with a diviner in India who could measure a person's shadow to tell their fortune. Whether or not such a book ever existed, it's likely that Gardner read Bashir's article and was inspired. Whatever the case, the phrase Book of Shadows doesn't appear in relation to witches until Gardner developed his own magical book in the late 1940s. The Book of Shadows went through a number of revisions and pulled from a wide variety of sources, including older grimoires, the work of more contemporary magicians like Aleister Crowley, and a number of uncited literary works. Doreen Valiente, perhaps Wicca's most influential high priestess, ended up rewriting much of Gardner's original Book of Shadows to remove some of these influences and to create a greater sense of continuity in the liturgy of this new religious movement. Between Gardner, Valiente, and a number of other witchcraft writers, it didn't take long for some of the contents of the Book of Shadows to make their way into the public eye, often in altered forms. And as these materials became more widely available, just about anyone could start practicing contemporary witchcraft. No need to seek out a secretive coven, maybe you can just become a witch by going to a well-stocked bookstore. In the late 20th century, popular witchcraft writers like Scott Cunningham, Silver Ravenwolf, Starhawk, and Raven Grimassi encouraged witches to take an eclectic approach to both Wicca and other forms of contemporary witchcraft. They advised readers to experiment and be creative, build a personal practice that feels right for the individual witch. I talk about this in my Intro to Wicca video, but the move toward eclectic, individualized practice highlights the two modes that we see in contemporary witchcraft, one trending more toward traditionalism and one toward eclecticism. We sometimes see a strong inclination toward traditionalism in modern grimoires, an inclination to preserve a lineage and to preserve ancient knowledge. More traditional forms of Wicca emphasize preserving a coven's Book of Shadows by copying it by hand and passing down knowledge and rituals between members of the priesthood. At the same time, other forms of contemporary witchcraft are characterized by eclecticism, an ethos to find your own individualized path. Practitioners are encouraged to experiment, to keep their own ritual notebook, and to avoid religious power structures. These two modes of traditionalism and eclecticism are sometimes at odds, but they're key parts of contemporary witchcraft today. New traditions of contemporary witchcraft gave rise to their own magical guidebooks. Some are commercially available, but others are privately passed on from teacher to student, just like the first versions of the Wiccan Book of Shadows. Contemporary witches, both Wiccan and non-Wiccan, use their books to record their personal experiences working magic and performing ritual. They may copy their favorite spells collected from other sources or compose original ones. They may also include interesting and relevant bits of folklore or history. Some books are fancy, mysterious tomes reminiscent of what you might see in romanticized media, but like I said, today they're just as likely to be a plastic 3-ring binder full of photocopied pages or spiral-bound notebooks filled with messy notes. Today, the phrase Book of Shadows is prominent among many kinds of witches across traditions, but other terms have also been adopted, and many variations on the personal magical book exist today. A growing number of witches today prefer the older term grimoire and specifically distinguish between these types of books. For them, the term grimoire refers to a collection of spells and rituals, something more like an instruction manual, whereas a Book of Shadows is a personal diary or magical record. At times, the term may also be used interchangeably, and some witches today no longer see the need to keep a personalized book, and instead build extensive libraries from commercially available texts or spend more time exchanging information online. So the grimoire has been thoroughly democratized, but what about the other aspect of grimoires that we talked about earlier? The magic of writing itself, in which we can conceptualize grimoires as objects of power. Because with the rise of the internet and social media, sometimes a Book of Shadows is not a book at all. More and more witches maintain digital records, organizing their materials on private servers, or even creating social media sites where they can share spells. Is a PDF file of the Key of Solomon a grimoire? Throughout history, so much of magical writing relies on its materiality, inscribing a door lintel with a symbol or incantation, wearing an amulet with a few verses from the Gospels, an ancient Roman scratching a curse on a lead tablet. These actions were thought to activate the spell in a sense, and the object is a necessary part of the equation, materializing the spell, making it more durable and practical. In her essay Almondal Grimoire, the book as magical object, the scholar Janice Grill argues that the dematerialization of books, the shift from physical to digital formats, risks losing their magic because it strips away the sensory aspects that have historically imbued books with power. She argues that the materiality of books, their weight, texture, and materials have been crucial in making them more than just tools for communication. These tangible qualities also allow books to function as magical objects, believed to affect reality and enabling people to ritualize them. However, practitioners of magic are, if anything, very creative, and continuously adapt over the centuries. So whether the dematerialization of books will diminish their magical role, or simply transform it into something new and unexpected, is yet to be seen among contemporary witches. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn more about contemporary witchcraft, we're offering an online lecture, What Does It Mean to Be a Witch?, taught by religious studies scholar Thorn Mooney. It'll be held on October 29th, and you can register at religionforbreakfast.eventbrite.com. She'll describe 4 modes through which contemporary witches understand and articulate their traditions, as religion, as spirituality, as practice, and as identity. These modes intertwine and overlap, giving rise to an eclectic movement that challenges many of the assumptions we have about the boundaries of what counts as religion in the first place. Thorn Mooney is an author and academic completing her PhD in religious studies at UNC Chapel Hill. You might have seen her around on her YouTube or TikTok channels or her interview on Anthony Padilla's show. She studies the messy spaces between secularism, magic, and religion, focusing on how these overlap and blur. Her latest book is Witches Among Us, Understanding Contemporary Witchcraft and Wicca, and I'm super excited she'll be joining us. Just in time for Halloween, we'll be holding the lecture on October 29th at 1:30 p.m. US East Coast time. Registration costs whatever you want, starting at $1. And as usual, we'll be recording the lecture and sending it out to everyone who registers, so don't worry if you can't make the lecture live. Again, to register, go to religionforbreakfast.eventbrite.com. Hope to see you there.